still continue the event and get what they said.
You're on.
Well, welcome. My name is Florence Bruce. I'm from the University of Iowa. I was also an MVSA officer and was on the first nominating committee for MVSA. It has occurred to many of us that even though this wasn't the center of intellectual history in the world, yet the history of our organization, the Midwest Professional Studies Association, does have some importance not only to us, but to the history of academic and wider intellectual life at the time. We are therefore starting a series of interviews with people who've been associated with this organization over the past. And fortunately, this is our second set of interviews, and we have with us 4 people from 4 different periods of MVSA's history. I'm going to ask each of them in turn to introduce him, and in my case later herself, and to say something about the period in which they were associated with MVSA, why they wanted to join, what meaning they think it had at the time within the context of the social movements and academic norms. And then later, perhaps we can turn to the issue of what they think about MVSA over the years or thoughts about its possible future purposes. So we will begin with Professor Richard Price, who was here in one of our very first meetings from the University of Maryland.
Yes, thank you. I seem to, my memory is, I'm a historian, but my memory is a little cloudy, I'm afraid, but I seem to remember that I was involved in the initial discussions about the creation of a Midwest Victorian Studies Association with Larry Poston, Nicholas Templey from Illinois, and several others. And the reason why it appealed to me, at that time I was teaching at Northern Illinois University in DeKalb, and the reason that it appealed to me was, first of all, because I'd come from an interdisciplinary background. Well, I guess when I was being trained in the formative years of my own formative years as a historian, I worked with a guy called Asa Briggs, who was, amongst others, who was one of the founders of the notion of Victorian studies. And so, but his big theme was the importance of interdisciplinarity in historical study. And so the notion, I mean, I'd always, that was part of my background. I always grew up with the idea that one should at least talk to and hopefully learn from and read the work of people outside of one's own particular specialism or discipline. So the interdisciplinarity was an important part of my own formation as a historian. So, and the Midwest Victorian Studies, the idea of a Victorian Studies Association was very appealing for that reason. The second reason that it was appealing was because, following on from that, and very practical, it got one out of got one out of one's own particular specialism. And I found when I became a professional historian that one tended to talk just to his other historians, and it was quite a real effort to reach out across the disciplinary boundaries, the department boundaries, to people in English, art history, musicology, other areas that might be relevant to one's own interests. So Victorian Studies again helped to mitigate against that, and it was I found the experience in the early years of the MVSA rather like I sensed this afternoon, actually, not having experienced it for quite some time. The kind of easy and helpful camaraderie and exchange between the various professional disciplines, and so working with people like Jane Stedman, who was active in it in the early years, or Nicholas Templey, was very interesting because they brought a perspective that was completely different from the perspective that I would come from the history department. The institution of sort of entertainment or theatrical and other entertainments as part of the gathering was there from the beginning. I was telling Florence, I remember in the early years, Jane Stedman arranged a performance of a Gilbert Sullivan piece, Ada, I think it is. It's not a very well-known, one of their very well-known operettas. So this, the event of the Gondoliers, the performance of the Gondoliers tonight is, for me, a rather nostalgic throwback to that particular experience. So I guess I would say that it was the desire to experience an interdisciplinary context, the desire to see the 19th century from different perspectives and to get different takes on themes and issues that were familiar to me as a historian. It was that drive or that interest that really drew me to Victorian Studies, the idea of a Midwest Victorian Studies Association. And I regret having lost touch with it.
Thank you. Perhaps the next person who should speak should be Professor John Reed, because he was there from the very beginning as a former president and active in guiding policies for many years.
So I'm John Reed, I'm from Wayne State University.
Louder.
Okay. One thing that appealed to me was the regionalism of the Midwest Victorian Studies Association. I had already attended some of the Northeast Victorian Studies Association meetings, and what I didn't like about them was that they had concurrent sessions. And you had to make a choice which one you'd go to. So when Larry proposed our system, he said from the beginning, we won't have concurrent presentations. And I like that very much. I also was deeply attracted to the interdisciplinary aspects. I have a degree in music and a degree in English, so I was actually exposed to more than one field. And I like that sensation of having knowledge of more than one area. And I think this group has prospered in that regard, that it really has had a lot of effect on scholars. I've gathered a lot of information from people I've met at these meetings and used it in my research and credited it. Another feature that I thought was extremely attractive in the early proposal was that we would be wide open to graduate student presentations. And at the time, not many places were. Many of the sessions that you could go to nationally did not accept graduate student submissions, whereas we were going to do that from the outset. Not only accept them, but pay for them. You know, somebody submits a paper and they get support to come to the presentation. And that's the Walter Arnstein Prize that you now give an honor to a graduate student who presents a good paper. So these were all features that I thought were extremely attractive. I didn't want to be an officer, but I ended up as one. I thought Larry was the person who should have been the first president, but he became the first secretary, and we thought he was going to be perennial secretary, but he finally yielded that. But it was wonderful to have Nicholas Temperley there right at the beginning, a very, very gifted musician and scholar, so that you had music fixed in the program from the beginning.
Well, great. Perhaps next we should hear from Professor Patrick Brantlinger of Indiana University, who was active for many years, and also, along with his Indiana University colleagues, formed a nucleus of people that we always recognized for many years, including Mary Bergan and Martha Basinas.
Yes, thanks, Florence. I will say that MVSA, I was not a founding member of it, but I did become vice president, in that order in, I think, the early 80s. Before that, I had participated as a paper giver, and that for me was a very valuable experience as a junior faculty member, and it has been that for many graduate students. I said to Laura Kriegel after her talk, she's now the director of the Victorian Studies program at Indiana. I pointed out to Laura, what she well knows, that she and I are the two faculty members here from Indiana. but there are a number of our former grad students here. And I'm sure they would say the same, that MVSA was a kind of starting point for them. Conference going, for me, always giving a paper at a conference was a good way to then maybe later produce an article and get that published. The other thing I'll say about the relations between the Victorian Studies Journal, which I edited for 10 years, Martha Vicinas before me for another decade, and Victorian Studies at Indiana, and then the various colleges and universities that now find MVSA a valuable association for their faculty and students. There's always been a sense, I hate to call it something like a sense of ownership on the part of Indiana University for the notion of Victorian studies. I will not name names, but I've heard one of the founding editors of the journal, Victorian Studies, get up before a big audience at another conference and tell us that he invented Victorian studies. Well, that of course is not true. You mentioned Asa Briggs. There are a lot of other people who were doing Victorian studies on an interdisciplinary model before Indiana faculty. The other thing I'll point out, when NAFSA was created, I worried about what would happen to regional conferences. And Dino Faluga, who was the main mover of NAFSA, is at Purdue. I didn't know Dino at the time. But of course I knew Andrew Miller and the people at Indiana. And I talked to Andrew, who had then taken over as editor of the journal, and explained to him that I thought the smaller regional conferences like MVSA might be an endangered species with the creation of NAFSA. So at least we worked out a kind of compromise where, I don't know about recent programs at NAFSA, but in the early going, the regional conferences like MVSA had their own panels at NAFSA. And I think that was helpful, at least kind of bridging the gap between this big national, really international Victorian Studies Association and the smaller outfits like MVSA. But just to conclude, I think MVSA has been invaluable for our graduate students. It was for me in the early stages of my career. And on that note, I will end.
Great. So finally, we have Professor Robert Katz. I'll speak later. And he was an executive secretary and officer at a slightly later time.
That's right. I go back only about 30 years.
Young guy.
I'm the junior member here by quite a bit. But I recall fondly my first meeting was in 1985. It was at the Newberry Library in Chicago. The theme for the conference was Victorians at Home. And the projected theme for the following year was, appropriately, Victorians Abroad. I got hooked by Victorians at Home and came back the next year and continued a regular springtime practice of coming to MVSA in April when I so much desperately needed to get away from my campus and my usual routines and to have this marvelous weekend respite with other people who are interested in the same things that I've been interested in. I would echo what several of my colleagues have said about the appeal of interdisciplinarity, but also I would say for me, coming from a small campus, small college, there's a strong appeal in being able to have conversation with people who shared my interest broadly in Victorian concerns. My department is a small one, and my colleagues in English don't necessarily share my disciplinary interests. And while at a liberal arts college I have the advantage of regularly having cross-disciplinary discourse, conversations, it's really great to be able to get together professionally with other people in my discipline and talk about George Eliot, for instance. One thing I really value in the organization over the years is that there's plenty of opportunity for social sharing of, again, interests and things that have been going on in one's life. We have dinners, but also some remarkable entertainment opportunities. One that sticks out in my memory is a Bloomington, Indiana meeting where we had a Victorian ball, including a dance mistress, a graduate student, I believe, probably one of Patrick's, trained in Victorian dance.
Mary Brigance, actually.
Okay. But we gathered at the county courthouse, I believe, and were shown the ropes, shown how to do some of these country dances, and was thoroughly delightful. Fortunately, I brought a dance partner along. My wife joined me, and over the years, she's come to a lot of these meetings and has participated in some of the social and entertainment events. So for me, it's been great. I served for 3 years as executive secretary, and then stayed on as a member of the executive board for a number of years. Dabbled in some internet communication for the first time back in the late 90s. So that's enough, I think. I'll turn it to the floor.
Thank you all. I have a few comments. First, I'll just say my participation when I was first hired in Iowa, I would characterize the whole intellectual climate as one of great debate and conflict, so that one had a sense that by what topics one chose and who was able to be in places, that an entire field was being created. I was happy when an MMLA meeting one year, I think 1976 or something, Larry Poston stood up and he said, would there be any interest in forming a Midwest Victorian Studies Association? That seemed like the most natural and inevitable idea that could possibly be, and I ran up and I told him I thought it was wonderful. So I was the token woman on the nominating committee that first year, even though I wasn't on the executive committee. So I've prepared just a little statement that I'd like to read. To me, as I look back over 36 years, I benefited from MVSA for reasons which had little to do with the factors which motivated me to join. I joined because as a Victorianist, I wanted to keep up with my field and learn about Victorian history, art history, etc. For a 34-year-old assistant professor, it was a decent career choice. However, what I gained was a sense that I shared something important with others, which can still be alive. I remember attending one of the Chicago MVSAs, probably during the 1980s, at which I think we visited a Victorian church and sat together while Mary Brigance led us in singing a hymn, the name of which I've forgotten. I'm not religious. The hymn was by literary standards a modest work, and under other circumstances I would have had few occasions to sing anything Victorian. But the song had that mingling of conviction, uplift, eccentricity, elevated language, and direct emotion which is so recognizably Victorian. Tears filled my eyes as I realized that there were 40 other people in the room of varying ages and types of institutions who also thought recreating and meditating on these Victorian efforts was just plain fun. We had each left behind the pressures and intricacies of our sundry jobs and their respective hierarchies to celebrate something that was deep in all of us and to our sense of identity. I have appreciated my departmental colleagues, and I've learned from and share many things in common with them. But the love of Victoriana for its own sake and for the meanings it still evokes is something I'm grateful to have been able to experience with my MVSA friends. Thanks. So, since we have a little bit of time, I thought I'd ask if any of you have thoughts on MVSA's future. I know Patrick and others have already brought up the fact that we are now distinctly identified as a regional organization as opposed to the very large organizations such as INCS and NAVSA that have come to dominate much of academic study. And I think that it's a really important change that we have fought back and we have found things that we can do that you just can't do with 500 people in the room. For instance, you mentioned the ball, and Nicholas Temperley's really elegant musical performances, and then more recently we had a Highland dance, and we've had many other things. But I think the do-it-yourself, just come and have a charade or have something that students and teachers can do together, not at the hyper-professional level, but just something done is a wonderful thing that only a smaller organization can do.
I would say something about the small regional organization and its value. I've encouraged some of my colleagues, not just in English, but in some of the other disciplines, to find a group like this and to become a part of it, and to keep coming back, whether one reads a paper at a conference or not. I think it's important to have the audience, an interested audience, and to have that interaction between paper readers and people in the audience who have expertise to share with the paper presenter. But the sense of being a regular and contributing member is very important. And I think in these times, it's perhaps a matter of economics, but many younger people go to conferences to give presentations and don't necessarily return to them. I think we've experienced that in MVSA. We would like people to come and present a paper and then come back and come back and come back again and establish an identity with the organization. It's so much easier to do with a small regional group than it is with a large national organization. So.
I'll just pick up on that. That was part of the original idea, to get people to come one time and then become regulars. And alas, that has not really happened. So,
Well,
I would second that.
You may have
well, I would disagree to a certain extent. I mean, I think that I see you
Yeah.
folks here and many other people, like Alyssa, has been active for quite a while, and and so a lot of people, and again, a lot of the students that I've had at IU, several of them are here at this conference and are repeats, like Tom Prosh, who's also been an officer of MVSA. So I think there is a continuity in this organization that you don't get in a big, well, those of us in English have all been to the Modern Language Association. And I can't imagine now, did I ever give, when I was a junior faculty member, a paper at MLA? I don't remember. However, for a graduate student even to contemplate giving a paper at MLA could potentially be a pretty terrifying experience. Who knows who's going to show up in those audiences?
And even MLA or
some other. This is a friendly organization. I was going to add to the Bob's comments about the dance we had in the courthouse. There was actually a tornado outside, or close by. And after the dance, we all walked outside. We saw limbs down in the streets. But we didn't hear anything. We heard the dance. We heard the music, and it was graduate students who produced that. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, just to add one word about regional organizations. I mean, I think two things I would say. First of all, I endorse the notion that they're really good places for graduate students to get their first or early paper giving experiences. And we do that in British Studies, the regional organizations. They have the same kind of, the National Association of British Studies and the regional ones. And the regional ones perform the same sort of function amongst others in that respect. The other thing I would say that this may be just a Midwest thing, because I always thought the Midwest compared to the East was a much more friendly place, frankly, and much more. There's a much more, much more less intense or less intense, yeah. And the thing about regional organizations like the MVSA is that they're part of the openness, or part of the nice atmosphere, is that they're not hyper-professional. Yeah, I mean, if you give a paper here, you're not going to have somebody some international star, typically in the audience, who's out to demonstrate their superiority. And the social occasions will be of a very different nature. So I think that's a very important aspect of regional associations too.
I think one nice feature that was there from the beginning and that to some degree we've been able to hang on to was that the question periods and discussion afterward are fairly extensive. Now, I go to MVSA every year and I go to, NAVSA, NAVSA every year, and I go to MLA talks, but quite frequently one can be in a room with 4 people. Now, that's a real pity to hear a really good paper, totally unrelated to the other papers, and people hasten off. Whereas within the limits of practicality, we try to have a bit of debate. And I thought we did that today, and presenting other aspects, asking questions in such a way as to open up a different view of the topic, and in some cases critiques. And there couldn't be anything more valuable for a speaker or for an audience than to hear a real discussion.
Yeah.
Another thing we've tried to do within the limits of financial feasibility is to hoard a series of prizes to gather money so that we can continue the MVSA tradition, because it's necessary to reach out. And so we have gathered the money for the Arnstein Prize and seen many young people receive it over the years.
And there's also the Bergan Prize, yeah.
For the best graduate student.
Yeah, that's the prize that was mentioned earlier, John mentioned earlier,
Keith Welch.
rather than the Arnstein Prize,
Yeah.
yeah.
And we hope to continue, of course, over the years to gather more.
Sure. Hymns. Since Florence mentioned hymns, and one that Mary Bergan had suggested. Quick story about Mary, you don't need to include this in the interviews.
No, go on.
Well, since she went off to Washington, D.C. to be General Secretary of the AUP, she's long since retired from that, she joined an African-American church there. Even though her background is Roman Catholic, she goes to this, I don't know, probably African-American Methodist church. She says because she likes the music and she sings in the choir. So she must have a really good time. Huh?
Ancient and modern hymns.
Yeah, those are good hymns. Those are the
I
good
think
stuff.
some of the best hymns
Methodist
are
hymns, yes.
Methodist in origin.
Yeah, and African-American too.
Jane Stedman used to be our sole representative from theatrical history. And we have a Stedman lecture each year in honor of her. I remember her as a very thin, very friendly, very eager woman who was essentially alone in her field of theater history because theatrical history didn't center on the Victorian period. I think for many of us there was the sense that other people didn't fully appreciate the Victorian period. That's not true for the Home of Victorian Studies, but it might be true of others. For many years I was in a department in which critical theory, perfectly reasonably, and narratological theory were dominant. So the notion of studying things within their historical context was just foreign. And it really meant a lot to me to meet with others who could understand why these topics were important.
Well, one of the things Martha Vicinas did when she organized the conference here at Michigan many years ago was put on a Victorian play. And I cannot remember the title of it now. It was a melodrama, a pretty well-known melodrama.
Wasn't it the trial?
Huh?
Wasn't it the trial?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Bulwer Lytton.
Oh,
Oh, wow.
The title will come back to me. So when I organized the conference at Indiana, I wanted to do the same thing. Nicholas Temperley had done a number of musical programs for MVSA. I thought, well, let's move away from that and do some theater. So I eventually got a group that was then called Bloomington Theater to produce Tom Taylor's Ticket of Leave Man.
Wow.
And they did, I thought, a splendid job. And I was very pleased with that.
was it Bulwer's Money?
Yes, it was
Okay.
Bulwer's Money,
Ah.
that Martha
Yeah.
had staged. Or the theater, I don't know whether the theater department had already planned to produce that play, and Martha cobbled onto it, or she asked them to. I tried to get Indiana's theater department to stage a melodrama for the conference. No. So I had to go into town and find a group there to do it. They did a really good job.
I worked with Walter Arnstein and Nicholas Temperley one year to plan a meeting in Urbana-Champaign, and Nicholas decided that he could get the university to do a performance of Elgar's
yeah.
Prima
Oh, yes.
Giranci.
Oh, yes.
That was great, yeah.
And he was passionate about this, and when he first, we were planning a year in advance on this, and when he first talked about it, I realized that it was just theoretical, but he in fact pulled it off, and it was a marvelous event. And Walter was so gracious of giving time and advice, and I was making the local arrangements from a distance and using them as consultants, actually. So I think we have moved in a good, different direction in that the executive secretary no longer has to bear quite so much of the burden. I think, Alyssa, maybe you could attest to this. We've got local arrangements people who are now doing a lot of the work, and that makes a big difference. But
There were some years that were
I'm
pretty,
sure
pretty
you
a
had
lot
the
of hard
same
work.
experience I had.
Yeah, but I think this last year, for instance, a lot has come off of my shoulders, and that's a good direction to go. And Florence really began that, really disseminating the work across the board and subcommittees a lot more, rather than just a few, like the secretary shouldering a lot, and the president. So that's been a very good thing that Florence and others have done recently.
Thanks.
One little thing about the Dream of Giranci. Nicholas was very worried. I think he shared this with you because they couldn't get in very many rehearsals.
Oh, yes, yes.
And he said, this is a complex work of art. And he was worried that there would be a disaster. But it was triumphant.
It was.
And it was
really
the first North American premiere of that.
Oh, really?
Of that work, so it was historically significant. Another neat feature of MVSA has been our venues.
Yes.
You wouldn't think that Topeka, Kansas, or some of the other places we have been.
Richmond, Indiana.
Yes, would be the top of someone's travel list. But I can remember lots of fun in Fort Wayne, Indiana, looking at old homes of a man who invented a plow. We have always gone to Victorian sites. When we were in Richmond, Indiana, the Hicks Quaker meeting was the place where we met one day. Many of these places, and then Topeka, Kansas, had its great anti-slavery history with the state capitol and so forth. All these are places I would not have visited or not have enjoyed so much if I hadn't had people to go around and see them with. So in a way, we're celebrating the Victorian aspects of the Midwest.
I remember going to a Northeast MLA to give a paper, and somebody asked me, "What are you doing in Boston?" And it occurred to me that our Midwest Victorian Studies meetings have had people not just from all over the country in attendance, but we've had international visitors regularly. And maybe that speaks to the welcoming nature of the Midwest character. But in contrast to the Easterner who wanted to know what somebody was coming to Boston for from central Illinois. Well, I actually like Boston quite a lot, but
Boston's an okay place.
Can I just ask, was that mix of national and international and local there from the beginning, or was that something that developed over the time? So, I mean, in the very early days, was it really just a Midwest
I
society?
think it was just the Midwest.
At first, yeah, probably.
Remember, it cost a lot more to travel around.
Sure.
People didn't travel as much by airplane.
I think besides the organization had to get up a reputation before it began to attract, say, people from Britain or even Canada. So
Also, in 1998, we put our first call for papers online.
Well, that would make a
And
difference.
the number of proposals that came in staggered me, and the fact that we were getting proposals from England and Australia and Canada. I think the first year that I fielded the proposals, we had something like 120 proposals, and we had 18 slots.
That also speaks to an interesting aspect of the profession, at least from the historian's point of view, that the way that it's become much more conference-based than it was when the MVSA was founded. So you could imagine founding the MVSA as a regional discussion or intellectual exchange group, and then by the mid-80s, or especially the British in particular, it became really important for them to get that on their vita. They give an international paper
Oh,
because
yes,
of the
and
new
REA
REA system of counting what you did. And so all of a sudden we saw that in the British Studies Association, the Conference on British Studies too. All of a sudden you get all these people wanting to come over to give a paper because it's a good thing, obviously, because it really does provide the kind of international cosmopolitan perspective and mix on things. But it reflects a structural change in the business.
Another reason why I think we were regional is that when we were founded, there was a very active and very good Northeast Victorian Studies Association. And so we had to do just as well as they did and pull ourselves together, but we also felt, I think, that sometimes current topics that were fashionable were not quite the ones that we wanted, and so we could have a distinctive view of what was important. Another thing that we've done over the years is gather together collections, and I think it's very important to have essay collections. We have one now coming out from our last conference, and we hope to have one on Victorian violence. But we had some from the beginning on Victorian urban spaces,
Yes.
and other publications. And it's a service to get people's papers out and available to be studied and read.
My first publication came out in that volume. It really helps for an upcoming faculty or hopeful.
I can remember early on, we tried to cooperate with the Northeast Victorian Studies Association because they were meeting at the same time we were.
yes.
And we tried to arrange it to be at least a week apart, but they wouldn't budge, nor would we. We were going to try and have a combined meeting one year.
Oh, yes.
That never came on.
No. Illustrating variations in Victorian stubbornness.
Yes.
But also realizing why we need to exist to continue to exist.
Exactly.
I want to mention, if I might, a couple of people who were my predecessors as executive secretary. Mike Clark and Chris Garrigan, most particularly Chris, who did a 4-year stint as executive secretary and then was president afterward. But she was very welcoming to me. She was the executive secretary when I first attended in 1985. And it was Chris who approached me about getting more actively involved in joining the executive board and ultimately agreeing to be executive secretary. And not only did she welcome me into a more active role, but she gave me a lot of time, especially in the first year. We arranged for Chris and Larry and another prior executive secretary, Dale Trella, to meet with me in Chicago, and we had a day-long brainstorming session about the organization. It's when I first broached the idea of going internet with the organization. We developed some ideas, some of which never were realized, and others I think that we were able to work out. but some really good people, welcoming people, people who worked hard, and I tried to be friendly to new folks, and as I know, Alyssa, you have done as well. When you see new people coming to the meeting for the first time, going out of your way to welcome them is important.
Well, and I remember you welcoming me, so it all goes around.
Other former presidents who were friendly and sociable included Susan Dean, who was a librarian and also someone with an interest in the history of Buddhism, and then Deborah Mankoff, who is an art historian in Chicago. And with them, we were able to meet many times in Chicago, which of course has lovely historical sites from the 1870s and onwards. So I'm thinking that this is the time to thank everyone. I thought that this was really interesting to hear the comments of you all, and so we thank you for participating.
Well, thanks to you,
Yes.
Florence, for doing this.
And it's, I think I represent the three behind the camera. Yeah, in thanking all of you for getting this organization started, which has meant so much to us. And those who continue on even after us, hopefully we'll do a we'll all try to do a credible job to keep your dream alive. And but it really has added a lot to the Midwest Victorian studies. So thank you all very much.
Yes.
Okay.